Hello and welcome back to a special edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director of GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Tuesday, March 16th. Today we're going to hear from a group of 3 local residents about an environmental issue that may not have received widespread attention yet, but soon may. Chris Anderson, Carol Berry, and Carl Bucholt are members of a climate action group called EarthMatters, which was formed 4 years ago to do whatever is possible on a local level to address the climate crisis. Several members of EarthMatters have been learning about and practicing regenerative agriculture, which is both a way of growing healthier food and a way to store carbon in the soil that reduces global warming. One basic component of regenerative agriculture is growing food without the use of chemical fertilizers or pesticides. In the course of their research, our presenters learned that a powerful herbicide called glyphosate, or glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, was the most widely used pesticide in both the United States and around the globe. The trio has put together a PowerPoint presentation to educate as many people as possible about the danger of glyphosate, that glyphosate poses to the soil, to water, to insects, birds, and other animals, as well as to people on the planet. Their hope is that a growing number of individuals and organizations will watch the PowerPoint presentation and decide that we need to change our dependence on harmful pesticides. So to get us started, we'll look to Carol Berry to begin the presentation. She'll be followed by Chris and then Carl.
All right. So, healthy soil, healthy food, healthy people. That's the name of our presentation, which is put together to inform and share our concerns about the use of toxic chemicals, pesticides in our environment, in our communities, and in our food production. We hope that with greater awareness of the harmful effects that toxic chemicals have, we can all become advocates for healthier alternatives in land management and food production. There are 3 parts to this presentation. I will give a general overview. Chris will talk about the history of glyphosate and explain the impact on soil, and Carl will talk about the impact of glyphosate on human health. Next. Seeing our food crops being sprayed with chemical solutions by people wearing hazmat suits can't but make us wonder what potential hazards we are exposed to and what is happening in our agriculture and in our food production. Although the United States is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, the number of people who suffer from all kinds of diseases is rising, especially autoimmune diseases, from which 1 in 5 in America suffer. There's a lot of research being done about the implications that our health is being compromised by the presence of toxic chemicals, for example, glyphosate-containing herbicides, in our environment and in our food supply. Next. What's in a pesticide? And by the way, a pesticide includes herbicide, fungicide, and insecticide. They're made up of formulations, and the main ingredient, the active ingredient, is the chemical that destroys the target organism. The active ingredient in Roundup, for example, is glyphosate. Then we have the so-called inert ingredients, which are chemicals that make the absorption of the active ingredient possible. In the case of Roundup, the inert ingredients break down the cell walls of plants so that glyphosate can enter. And these inert ingredients actually add to the toxicity of the pesticide. Then metabolites, I'm going to mention, are often more hazardous than the active ingredients, and they are the breakdown products when the active ingredient comes in contact with air, water, and soil. Next. As said previously in our presentation, we will focus on glyphosate or Roundup, which is the most widely used herbicide in the world. Next. This presentation is not given only to create an awareness of the harm glyphosate and other pesticides pose. but to also offer ways to become actively engaged and empowered to make changes. But we can only do that by being informed. At the end of this presentation, we will show you a list of organizations that offer a lot of information as well as solutions and alternatives to making healthier choices in land management and food production. This here on the screen is an example of a fact sheet produced by an organization called Beyond Pesticides. It contains information about the health effects of commonly used pesticides. So with such information, you can become a more effective advocate for healthier environment. Next. These numbers will give you some information about the scope of the use of glyphosate in the United States. Between the first application of glyphosate in 1974 until 2014, there is a 200-fold increase. And in Vermont, the usage of glyphosate also increased by 10,000 pounds in 5 years. On the graph, you can see that the increase in using Roundup occurred especially after Monsanto's Roundup Ready soy, corn, and cottonseed became available, and you'll hear more about that. Glyphosate-containing herbicides are also sprayed on a range of fruits, nuts, and vegetables. The soil is sometimes pre-treated with glyphosate before planting some crops, like spinach. In California alone, in 2012, glyphosate treated approximately 5 million acres for all kinds of crops. And in addition, glyphosate-containing herbicides are being sprayed on fields, around our utility poles, along highways and railways, in forestry, on lawn care, on golf courses. We almost can't escape glyphosate-treated areas. And to make things worse, glyphosate is also harming beneficial insects like pollinators. Next. Glyphosate-containing herbicides are also, and this is disconcerting, used as pre-harvest treatments to desiccate, meaning to speed up the drying process of crops like wheat, oats, barley, and potatoes. This helps the farmers harvest their crops more efficiently and at less cost. But spraying glyphosate right before harvest means the food directly absorbs the glyphosate residues. And that means you cannot wash them off. We ingest them. Think about that. In 2018 in Vermont, there were still about 280 different pesticides listed on the website of the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. Many have not been fully tested for safety. The overall pesticide use in Vermont is high, and as you can see, it doubled in 5 years. And with the overuse of pesticides, the fertility of crop soil is being depleted. This results in producing crops that have a lower nutritional content. And in addition, a depleted soil is less able to sequester carbon, which has a major impact on climate change. And then the overuse of glyphosate specifically has created a huge problem. The target weeds have developed resistance to the toxins and are becoming what they call super weeds. And that is why a whole new arsenal of other potent pesticides are being used to combat these super weeds. Next. Here is a list of some of these pesticides that are added or replacing Roundup. 2,4-D is mostly used on lawns, on corn, in fields, and forage. Then we have dicamba, which is mostly used on corn and fields and forage, and also on golf courses and lawns. It has a tendency to drift and affect fields close by. Atrazine is used on fields. It is seeping into wells, and it is known as a hormone disruptor. It is banned in Europe. And then we have chlorpyrifos, which is a neurotoxin affecting humans and all other life forms, including decimating pollinators. So all of these chemicals are harming us. Next. A little history lesson. Before Roundup and these other pesticides you just saw became widely used, there was the insecticide DDT, originally used in the 1940s to kill insects that carry diseases. DDT pesticides were used in farming, home gardens, and forests. And as you can see, the slogan, DDT is good for me, it is as safe as table salt, coined by the manufacturers, informed us that this toxin was considered to be safe. But today, we know DT is a human carcinogen and detrimental to the environment. It was banned in 1972, but residues are still found in the environment 50 years later. It was Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, that drew attention to the indiscriminate use of pesticides and the harmful effects of DDT and its pervasiveness in the environment and in human bodies. Next. Rachel Carson called for humans to act more responsibly and carefully and as stewards of the living earth. And one of the concluding remarks in her book is that there is no safe amount for the use of any chemical toxin due to the accumulative effect from every drop or spray applied, and because nature's balance is destroyed when unnatural toxins interfere. Next. In the 1990s, a familiar slogan was perpetuated by the manufacturer of Roundup, Monsanto. Roundup is safer than table salt. And they claimed it is practically non-toxic to mammals, including us, birds and fish. We were also told that it is environmentally friendly and biodegradable. Since most of us are not chemists, we could only believe and trust this was true, just like we did with DDT. Chris and Carl will talk about the fact that glyphosate is not environmentally friendly, and it is not non-toxic to mammals. Roundup, by the way, is available in most stores that sell gardening products, but glyphosate itself isn't found only in Roundup. It is registered to be used in many, many other products. Next. All over the world, agencies are grappling with issues of safety when it comes to the amount of any pesticide in food and water. And there are many different opinions and regulations. Here you have an example from the year 2017 of what was considered the safe average daily intake of glyphosate in food and the maximum residue level of glyphosate in drinking water in the European Union and in the United States. Based on these numbers, we in the United States have been exposed to 3.5 times more glyphosate in our food and 7,000 times more residue of glyphosate in our drinking water than people in the European Union. This is one of the reasons we believe why so many people here suffer with health issues. And these kinds of statistics should make us question and become engaged with the pesticide regulations in our country. Next. And remember, these studies were done on glyphosate, but formulations such as Roundup are more toxic than just glyphosate alone due to the added ingredients. And this increase in toxicity needs to be taken into account. What equally needs to be taken into account is that, as you saw on the previous slides, pesticides such as glyphosate and Roundup are not the only toxic synthetic pesticides we are exposed to. And then, in addition, we are also exposed to chemicals that are mixed into our processed food. So all these substances accumulate in our bodies and have synergistic effects. That is, when several substances are combined, they react with each other in our bodies and enhance the toxic overload. Next. But there is good news. For more and more, we do read about investigations and new rulings regarding pesticides. As you can see on this map, countries all over the world are banning or restricting glyphosate. In a huge win for small farmers, the Mexican president issued a decree that will phase out the use of glyphosate and genetically modified corn in the country by 2024. Next. As of 2018, cities and counties in the states listed on your left have restrictions in place or have banned glyphosate. New York State is planning on banning glyphosate on state-owned lands by the end of the year. And in Vermont, we have two bills, or they have been introduced, to ban the sale or application of glyphosate and also of the herbicide atrazine. Next. So we are hoping that instead of these lawn signs, we will see this kind of a sign on lawns and fields around us, because we can all advocate for an organic and regenerative approach to agriculture and land management so that we will have healthier soil, which will grow healthier and more resilient plants, which in turn will be nutritious and healthy for us all. And now Chris will take you through the history of glyphosate and how it affects our soil.
Thank you, Carol. So glyphosate, or glyphosate, is a molecule that contains carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. It is nitrogen phosphonomethylglycine. The best known product is Roundup by Monsanto, but many other companies have manufactured and formulated their own glyphosate-based herbicides with names like Rodeo, Pronto, Cleanup, and Eraser. Glyphosate was first synthesized by the Stauffer Company in 1961 as a chelator, or a descaling agent. And in 1964, Monsanto began selling glyphosate as a chelator to remove elements like calcium and iron from water boilers and water pipes. In 1970, Monsanto discovered that glyphosate was also an herbicide that kills both grasses and broadleaf plants. The plant dies because glyphosate disrupts a biochemical pathway, the shikimate pathway. Without this essential pathway, a plant cannot make certain proteins that it needs for growth. Glyphosate starves the plant. Both plants and microorganisms have the shikimate pathway, but animals, including humans, do not. And for this reason, Monsanto claimed that glyphosate could not harm people. It took a few years, but eventually Monsanto came up with a formulation containing glyphosate, which they called Roundup. It first came on the market in 1974. And as Carol mentioned, Roundup has many other chemicals added to it to help the active ingredient glyphosate do its job of killing weeds. Much of the research done on the safety of glyphosate has been done with glyphosate alone and has not included the many so-called inert ingredients in the glyphosate-based herbicides. In 1996, Monsanto released their first Roundup Ready seeds, soybeans. And these seeds have been genetically engineered or modified. After soybeans, Monsanto genetically engineered corn, canola, sugar beets, cotton, and alfalfa, all to be Roundup Ready. The plants that grow from these seeds are genetically altered so that glyphosate will not kill them. So when glyphosate is sprayed on a field of Roundup Ready corn or cotton, for example, it will not harm the corn or the cotton. It will only kill the weeds that are growing in the field. Unfortunately, many weeds have quickly become resistant to glyphosate, so now farmers use additional herbicides to kill these resistant weeds using different mechanisms. So Monsanto has genetically engineered the seeds further so that the crops will be resistant to these other herbicides, as well as to glyphosate and to various insecticides. This US map from 1992 shows the use of glyphosate before the introduction of Roundup Ready seeds. The yellow areas indicate areas where less glyphosate is being used, and darkening to brown in areas of greater use, such as in the San Joaquin Valley in California. But 22 years later, with Roundup Ready seed use, the dark brown areas have greatly increased, where glyphosate is being more heavily sprayed. According to the Food and Drug Administration in 2018, 94% of soybeans, 94% of cotton, and 92% of all the corn grown in the United States is grown with glyphosate. Finally, in 2010, Monsanto was granted another patent for glyphosate as an antibiotic. Glyphosate kills bacteria and fungi. It kills microorganisms. So that is 3 plants for glyphosate: chelator, herbicide, antibiotic. But companies still claim that it is safe for us to eat food grown with glyphosate. But let's look at the research of what the research shows about glyphosate's effects on soil health and plant health to learn how it could be affecting our health. We have to go way back in time to the microbes, which were the first life forms on the planet. Plants and animals evolved with microbes, setting up mutually beneficial or symbiotic relationships with each other to perform essential tasks for each other. The microbes that help plants live in the soil around the plant roots, in the zone called the rhizosphere. These microbes include bacteria and fungi, and they are referred to as the soil microbiome. The soil microbiome contains billions of microbes. In just 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, there are as many microbes as there are people on our planet. That's 7 billion microbes in a teaspoon of healthy soil. Now, we all learned that a plant using the sun's energy takes carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil to make carbohydrates or sugars through the process of photosynthesis. The plant uses some of these carbohydrates, but 30 to 70% of the carbohydrates are given off through the plant roots to the microbes in the soil. And this is illustrated on the right side of the screen as a symbiotic exchange between the plants and the microbes. The microbes are getting the carbon that they need through the carbohydrates from the plants. What are the plants getting from the microbes? Why would a plant give up 30 to 70% of its food production? Well, let's just consider the fungi. This electron microscopic photo shows the fungal roots called hyphae. There are miles of these fungal hyphae in the rhizosphere. The hyphae greatly increase the root capacity of the plant. And incidentally, this is one of the reasons why tilling soil is bad for the soil. The tilling tears up the fungal hyphae. The plant depends on the hyphae to get nutrients and water. The fungal hyphae give off enzymes to dissolve minerals from rock surfaces. These enzymes can bind with the minerals, and the hyphae take them back to the plant roots. Minerals like calcium, copper, zinc, sodium, iron. The plant has done its job of making carbohydrates available to the fungi, and in exchange, the fungi make these important nutrients available to the plant and available to us when we eat the plant. However, when glyphosate is sprayed on the plant, it makes its way out through the roots and into the soil. Since glyphosate is a chelator, when it gets into the soil, the glyphosate latches on to these important minerals, making them unavailable to the plant, and therefore unavailable to us. We expect to get these minerals from the food that we eat, but food that is grown with glyphosate is not as nutritious as food grown without glyphosate. So now, instead of 1 apple a day, we need 25. There are many other tasks that microbes do for plants. For example, the rhizobium bacteria that live in the nodules of peas and bean plants make nitrogen available to the plant. Some microbes assist plants in defending themselves against diseases and harmful insects. Other microbes aggregate or glue soil particles together for better water penetration, which helps plants survive during drought conditions. Microbes are necessary for healthy soil and healthy plants. But remember the patent by Monsanto in 2010. Glyphosate is an antibiotic. It kills soil microbes. It destroys the soil microbiome. Fewer microbes means less healthy soil, less healthy plants, less healthy food, leading to animals and humans that are not as healthy. To summarize, glyphosate is a chelator, a caustic descaling agent. It is an herbicide. It kills plants. Glyphosate is an antibiotic. It kills microbes in the soil. And there is increasing evidence that glyphosate disrupts the microbes in our bodies, which we are now going to hear about from Carl.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the beginning when life evolved on our planet. And the most important thing to remember is that the microbes were here first, and that we humans evolved in the context of all of these invisible friends of ours. We humans are not separate from all of these bacteria, viruses, and fungi that populate the planet. Very important to remember that. We're more like an ecosystem that has so many of these microbes in us. And our health is directly related to the health of the bacteria and microbes. So our body contains trillions of these bacteria. They're literally all over us, every single organ, our skin, our eyes. Most of them are in our digestive tract or our gut. So we call that the gut microbiome or gut biome. And by some estimates, there are 40 trillion of these bacteria and microbes in our intestines. It's a little depiction of the inside of your intestine. The lining are all of these purplish, brownish, little balloon-looking things. They're called villi. And they help to sort out all of the nutrients in the food and allow the good things to go through and keep the bad stuff inside. So all these different colored, red, green, purple, yellow, those represent all of the bacteria and the microbes. If the wall of the intestine were laid flat, it would cover an area 1.5 square miles. And the amazing thing is the thickness of our intestine is one cell's thickness. So it's a permeable barrier that relies on the bacteria to keep us alive, basically. So it's a symbiotic relationship. We need the bacteria, they need us. We feed them, and in return, they repair intestinal lining, they make vitamins and amino acids that we can't produce by ourselves. And our gut microbiome is responsible for our immune system. But glyphosate, an antibiotic, it kills bacteria. The gut microbiome is affected by what we eat. It has to be. I mean, where's it going to go? And if we eat foods containing glyphosate, that kills the healthy bacteria that we need and creates a condition called dysbiosis, which, if you think about it, is the opposite of symbiosis. And dysbiosis is associated with so many of our 21st century chronic health problems. I'll show you a slide later with all the list of them. Children are especially vulnerable to glyphosate, and I'll show you a little list of these childhood diseases like ADHD and asthma. ADHD was always prevalent. I've been working with kids since 1968, and there was occasionally a kid or two. But in my last work as a school psychologist, there were many, many more kids being presented with problems like ADHD, type 2 diabetes, food allergies. They become really a pandemic all by themselves. All of these problems did not exist, or if they were present, it was only a tiny percentage of the US population before Roundup. As an example, let's look at autism. The red line on this graph is the amount of glyphosate used, and it's in 1,000 tons, that number on the right-hand side. And then the yellow bars are the number of children who are identified as having autism through the special ed process. So in 1974, before Roundup, only one child in 5,000 had autism. Today, one child in 54 has autism. And it's estimated if we don't stop doing what we're doing, by the year 2035, 1 in 3 children will have an autism spectrum disorder. A woman who wrote this book, Michelle Perot, is a pediatrician with 35 years experience working with kids, especially kids with very hard to diagnose and hard to treat problems, the chronic problems, like you saw the list before. She says clearly that the systemic health failures among our children are a result of something even more troubling than the physical symptoms in their bodies. They, meaning the health failures, are the cumulative outcome of being born into and living in an environment that has been made toxic by agrochemical industrialized food production, like this. Shows an example of conventional agriculture, where you have genetically modified seeds planted in dead soil. And so you have to use chemical petroleum-based fertilizers for them to grow at all. And then they're liberally sprayed with glyphosate to kill the weeds. This is our conventional agriculture in this country today. And this chart you saw before, this graph, it ends in 2010. As Chris mentioned, by now, practically 100% of soybeans, cotton, and corn are grown with genetically modified seed and glyphosate. We are, without a doubt, in the middle of a health crisis. And not coincidentally, our health crisis mirrors the climate and environmental crisis. I'm going to show you 4 graphs. The blue line that goes up is a percentage of genetically modified corn and soybeans grown in the country. The red line is the amount of glyphosate applied to those crops. Now look at the green line. The green line is the trend that this is, a particular one is looking at thyroid cancer. This is like the number of cases of thyroid cancer in the country. So before glyphosate and GMO seeds, we would have expected a certain level of thyroid cancer. And then the yellow bars are, in fact, the incidence of thyroid cancer. So you can see they mirror each other pretty closely. The green line was going up for Parkinson's disease, but now the incidence is skyrocketing. And again, it coincides with glyphosate use. Diabetes, it's overwhelming the population in this country right now. And again, glyphosate use mirrors the increase in diabetes. And the same with kidney failure. All of these chronic conditions, anxiety, Crohn's disease, depression, especially autoimmune diseases, celiac disease, all of these have been linked to glyphosate and Roundup. Why are we having so many health problems? Well, if you eat food grown the conventional way with glyphosate GMO seeds, of course we're going to ingest it. And then as Carol said, they spray glyphosate on wheats, oats, barley, potatoes, just before they harvest them. And then think about the chicken and the beef and the pork we eat. All of those animals are being fed grain grown with GMO seeds and glyphosate. And they're also fed antibiotics because, number one, they would get sick because they're crowded together and never see the light of day, for chickens anyway. And they also feed them antibiotics to help them put on weight. And we're not even going to talk about the Franken crops where they've been genetically modified to be their own insecticide. And then we're supposed to eat that. So let's look at some of the research, just a brief overview. Epidemiological evidence supports strong temporal correlations between glyphosate and all of these cancers in red: breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, kidney, thyroid, liver, bladder, leukemia. Epidemiologists, by the way, are called disease detectives. They are the ones who really look at and study what causes a disease, who is at risk, and how can we prevent it. So the evidence they found is very, very strong in terms of a correlation between glyphosate and these diseases. And that's not causation. This goes up and this goes up. But there was a study in 2019 that found direct causation: glyphosate use, cancerous tumors. So this is very important. It's not just a coincidence, but the glyphosate clearly causes cancer. Findings from experimental animal studies, like the one you just saw, and meta-analysis of human epidemiological studies suggest a compelling link between exposures to glyphosate-based herbicides like Roundup and an increased risk for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In fact, there were 3 major court cases by plaintiffs who were using Roundup in their work and developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In the course of that trial, it was exposed that Monsanto actually knew there was a link between Roundup and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And that's probably why the juries awarded so many millions of dollars. So now the Bayer Corporation, who bought out Monsanto, they're offering $11 billion to settle some of these 125,000 lawsuits. In the scary study, 93% of pregnant women had detectable levels of glyphosate in their urine, which correlated significantly with a shorter gestation period. So the more glyphosate, the shorter your pregnancy. And it's not just women, but there's been a 59% decrease in the fertility among men. So it's having an effect all across the board. In another study that I have to admit freaked me out because of the implications, I have grandchildren. They did experiments giving glyphosate in water to the first generation of lab rats and lab mice. No symptoms. Their children were not given any glyphosate, no symptoms. But the third and the fourth generation developed diseases when they became adults. So this is the study. Ancestral environmental exposures to toxicants like Roundup promote the epigenetic transgenerational inheritance of adult onset disease. So my grandkids wouldn't even have to be exposed to glyphosate. I mean, they will be because they're eating food, but they wouldn't even have to be for them to develop prostate, kidney, ovarian diseases like cancer and birth defects. So there is a change that happens, not in our DNA, but in the codes that read them, that transmit diseases from one generation to the next. Pretty scary stuff. So you're probably asking yourself, why is this even legal if it's that dangerous? One of the reasons, the World Health Organization did come out in 2015 saying that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. In 2017, the EPA said, no, glyphosate is not carcinogenic. Why the discrepancy? The World Health Organization used peer-reviewed studies. Now that's the industry standard to tell what's scientifically valid. The EPA used the studies provided by Monsanto, many of which, well, all the ones by Monsanto were not peer-reviewed. Really incredible. In fact, there was a study done in 1982, a big study with 200 mice, in which they did find that glyphosate caused cancer. So the EPA initially did say, it possibly could cause cancer, but Monsanto pushed back and pushed back. The EPA said, well, do another study. Monsanto said, nope, we don't need it. We're not going to bother. So Carrie Gillam, who wrote this book called Whitewash, tells a complete story of why the EPA and the Food and Drug Administration are not banning glyphosate. It's basically a question of politics and influence. So glyphosate is not safe, but it is still legal right now because of, she said, the corruption of science by the big ag companies. So I will end with a quote from Jane Goodall. How could we have ever believed that it was a good idea to grow our food with poisons? So we're going to share a couple of different ways for you to have an impact on the situation.
Well, we put together a list on ways to reduce pesticides in our food. One of them is to buy locally grown food from farmers directly. You can go to farmers markets where you can actually engage with the farmers and find out what type of agricultural practices they have. We can also go to our own supermarkets and ask for organically grown food to be sold, which they're beginning to do in many of them. If possible, of course, grow your own vegetables and fruits without synthetic pesticides. And then advocate for and support the regenerative agricultural practices by farmers in your area. One of the organizations that are very helpful in making good decisions about our food is the Environmental Working Group. And you will get the website address later. But they actually make yearly investigations into which produce, which foods and fruit and vegetables have the most pesticides on them, and then advise you to buy those particular foods as organic foods. But they also have a list for the 15 clean vegetables and fruits where you do not have to worry about having them be organic. So these are just some ideas. Next.
So another option is to change your lawn. Lawns are monocultures. They're just growing grass, and they don't support anything but the grass plants, which are very short-rooted. They're not feeding the microbes. And so your soil is not a living, healthy soil if you have a lawn. Also, they do require lots of water because the grass is short-rooted. Regular mowing, which uses fossil fuel. And you're probably feeding them artificial fertilizers and spraying pesticide perhaps. But you can change your lawn. First of all, you could raise your blade to 3 inches, and that will let your grass plants grow taller, and it will encourage deeper root growth so they can access water when it is dry, as the water is deeper in the ground. You can switch to using organic fertilizers, such as compost. And without pesticides, the soil microbes will be healthier and will actually help your grass plants grow better. If you're not mowing as short, you will see some other interesting plants grow up in your lawn. And dandelions, of course, you should let them grow, especially in the spring, because they're often some of the first food that bees have, the first nectar they get in the spring. But other plants will start to grow. And as you see them getting flower buds, you shouldn't mow in those areas because you never know, they could be a great pollinator plant. Another option is to take part of your lawn and make a new pollinator garden, planting some native plants that will attract not just honeybees, but many of the other bee species that we have. Or you could turn your whole lawn into a meadow. Who wouldn't love to see all these great flowers growing out your door? And first of all, you'll save money by not needing a lawnmower or a weed whacker. You won't be using fossil fuel, and you'll just have so much more biodiversity, birds and other insects, especially the pollinators, coming into your backyard. And now?
So I'm going to show you a list of websites, but I want to urge everyone watching this to become a little more active in asking not just about, is your food grown organically, but ask principals at schools and your select board chairs, what's being sprayed? You know, are our playgrounds and school grounds, sports field, are they being sprayed with pesticides? If so, ask them to change to organic ways of doing things. Sign up for newsletters. The Beyond Pesticides is a great organization, especially if you want to find out alternatives for lawn care that does not involve toxic chemicals. So talk to your neighbor, next door neighbors, across the street, around the block, and ask them, what are you using on your lawn? And if they're using Roundup, you should have a little talk with them. So here are the groups that Carol put together, this list of websites. The Beyond Pesticides one, very handy. Pages and pages of alternatives to harmful, toxic pesticides. So I urge you to at least, contact one of these groups, the Environmental Working Group, EWG.org, for that list of the Dirty Dozen foods or the Clean 15. So that concludes our presentation. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. That was certainly a fascinating presentation. A lot of stuff there I didn't really know about at all, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers weren't aware of either. I just had one quick question just to close out our discussion in the very few minutes that we have left before we have to go. Thinking about this, industrial farmers, for lack of a better term, farmers who grow thousands of acres of food, is there a realistic alternative for them to use a different sort of insecticide or herbicide other than Roundup or a product that would contain glyphosate? Or because I'm assuming that it must be pretty widely used out in parts of the Midwest and other parts of the country where agriculture, where a lot of our food comes from. Is there such a product available for them, or is that still under research?
Well, the answer is you do not need the chemical fertilizers or the pesticides, whether it's insecticides or herbicides. You don't need them at all if you're growing regeneratively. And there's a book I highly recommend called Dirt to Soil by a fellow named Gabe Brown. And he has 5,000 acres in North Dakota, which occasionally gets very dry. And he has proven that his fields can withstand drought. They don't flood like his neighbor's field. And he's producing both food and he's growing animals and grazing them holistically. He does not use pesticides. There are plenty of alternatives that are much healthier for the soil and for the plants, and then ultimately for us. So the answer is, it's not a question of substituting one chemical for another. You have to basically try to mimic nature, the way nature handles things. So again, Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. Read this book, it'll change everything you think of about the pesticides.
And one last question, thinking how folks might inform themselves to whether or not they're buying food, local supermarkets or wherever that would not contain glyphosate. Is that clearly labeled on most food products in some way or another, or is it kind of guesswork or just an assumption that it probably does, unless you're buying at a farmer's market or someplace that's clearly labeled as organically produced?
Right. Well, I'll answer that. If it doesn't say organic, or if it doesn't say glyphosate free, you can almost assume it's going to have glyphosate in it. Mm-hmm. It's become so ubiquitous at this point, there's hardly a commercial crop grown that doesn't use it.
Right. Wow. Well, again, that was really fascinating to watch and listen to, and thank you all for sharing all of that with you. Carl Bucholt, Carol Berry, and Chris Anderson, really appreciate you making the time to share all that with us, and hopefully our viewers will find that as interesting as I did watching it all.
Can I just say one more thing?
Sure.
For the viewers.
About 30 seconds.
Carol, Chris, and I are available if you would like us to do this presentation to your parent-teacher group, your garden club, select board, whoever will be available.
Yes, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to be on GNAT. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. My pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, we'll have to leave it there for now. I'm sure there's much more we could all talk about this very interesting and important subject, but that'll have to be where we leave it for today. But I want to thank you all for being with us. Hope you found the program interesting, and we'll see you again the next time on GNAT-TV. Have a great day, everyone.